My name's Connor Langlois, part of the sales team here at Shift Care. And for those of you who don't know who we are, we're a platform designed very specifically for the senior care and disability space, providing structure and automation around things like scheduling, timekeeping, really just managing documentation for an agency. Um, and we meet with anywhere from 100 to a few hundred agencies a week, and pretty quickly we found there's a lot of big questions that go beyond the limits of our platform. So we decided to kick off this webinar series last month with Sarah Barker, focusing on how to find and retain clients. And of course, second biggest question we see is, how do you keep those caregivers that you find, as well as how do you get caregivers? So we have David Knack on today, a resident expert in caregiver engagement, and he is with Zengage as well as Hindsight Home Care Hindsight podcast. So, David, thanks for joining, and excited for our conversation today.
Yeah, same here, Connor. Thanks for having me on. Good to see everybody. Connor and I are here to, make this really valuable to you guys. So chime in with your questions. We're kind of open books, and while we're not operators, we talk to a whole bunch of home care owners, and so happy to share what we've heard works really well from the field.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we're kind of going through here, just a few housekeeping items. Of course, David and I will be hosting today. Um, Before we get to the Q&A, please keep audio off. Add any questions in the chat, and this will be recorded on our webinar section of shiftcare.com after the fact. So looking forward to the Q&A at the end here, but we're going to start off with a little discussion, jump into the software itself for ShiftCare as well as Engage, and then we'll get to that Q&A. So to kick things off, David, I would love to know a little bit about your background and how quickly, at least in my experience, you've jumped to being the expert in this space. What's that
Yeah.
journey look like?
Well, first of all, if you buy a podcast microphone on the internet and there's no like waiting list or anything, like they don't do like a background check, nothing. Uh, People will assume you're an expert, so I may have not actually earned that. But one of the things that I did pretty quickly after jumping into home care just a little bit over a year ago was identifying some of the real experts and thought leaders in this space. Sarah Barker is somebody that I came across pretty early in my tenure, and I have a lot of respect for the way that she approaches referral marketing, and I think that's totally a overlooked skill set for a lot of owners. They feel really confident talking to clients and their families, but they don't feel really confident going to referral sources and asking for the business in that context. So I think, for anybody who's maybe new to this space and wants to learn. I have the number 2 podcast in home care. I don't know what the number 1 is. I just know it's not mine. Can't be that good. But I have a lot of great people on who've got a ton of experience and are super open about the stuff that they've done well and the stuff that they've screwed up. But prior to being in home care, a big part of my career has been working alongside family businesses and entrepreneurs. And I think if you want to go into business for yourself, industry aside, you're kind of crazy because you think you can kind of make this thing work on your own. And I like being around those kinds of people. I think especially if you think you can make home care work, which is a kind of crazy logistical enterprise to undertake. You're trying to get caregivers to get matched up with clients and keep everybody, all the trains arriving on time in that sense. It's a really difficult business to be successful in. I know everybody on this call probably could make more money doing something else, but it's a really impactful mission. The work that the folks that I get to talk to every day, the work that they're doing is so important and kind of holds our society together in a lot of ways. And so, it feels funny that I've only been in home care for a year because I feel like I kind of always should have been here. And so as soon as I got in, I realized like these are really knowledgeable people, really energetic people, creative, solving big problems, but also they're just super kind, compassionate, empathetic people, and the kind of folks that I like to hang out with.
Yeah, I love that, David. And I completely agree. It makes working this industry so much fun when you're working with, like you said, such creative entrepreneurs whose whole focus is on supporting a community in a way where, the mainstream, it's kind of in the background, right? But um, one thing I'm curious about, you mentioned, all of these different entrepreneurs that are operating within, let's say, a couple miles of each other. Your podcast being called Home Care Highlight, have you found that building on the experience of others has been super helpful in terms of spreading like knowledge about what has worked versus what hasn't?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting to me about home care, and this is probably painting with like a little bit too broad of a brush, but like I don't know that most owners see themselves as competitive with even the folks that are in their like exact geographic territory. I've talked to people who the way they got to know each other was by doing like reference checks on caregivers who came in. And so would reach out to each other as like direct competitors and would say, "Hey, Connor, I saw that you employed so and so. Was she a pretty good person to work with?" And all those kinds of things. And there's like I think a lot of like an understanding that, hey, the problem of providing services to people who need home care, either because of age or disability or whatever, is such a big problem that it's not like the pie is so big that it's not worth us like squabbling over the competitive territory. And so I think like part of why some of the stuff I've done has been successful with the podcast and whatnot, but also I think part of why this industry is as unique as it is because people are just really open and collaborative about like these are really big problems and we're all trying to solve them together. Like, yeah, I may lose a client to you every once in a while. You may lose a caregiver to me every once in a while. But at the end of the day, like we're both, rowing in the same direction, trying to solve like a much bigger problem together. I don't know. It's just such a collaborative industry. And I think it's an industry where people just don't have a lot of ego because everybody knows at the end of the day, like all these businesses are like, as well as we can try to plan the operations and set stuff up for success, like stuff is always going to go sideways. We're always going to have to figure out how to do stuff on the fly. And it's just kind of a reality of the industry.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I'm always so impressed whenever I go to like the HCAOA or a state conference, how much collaboration there is. And like you said, it's there's no limit on people who need care, it seems, right? But a limit, of course, that we've been seeing is not only access to caregivers, but ways to tap into your network of caregivers and keep them happy. So I would love to know a little bit about Zengage as well as, why now? It seems like this has
Yeah.
been such a big challenge. Why is it seemingly only being tackled on a higher level at this point?
Yeah. I think it's really interesting in some ways. Um, I think a couple of financial crises, you know, have kind of insulated us from how serious this caregiver shortage has been. I looked back at we know the kind of headline number today is that turnover in 2023, this was what came out in the 2024 Activated Insights benchmarking report, was at 79.2%. And probably everybody on this call who employs caregivers knows that it's not just 79.2% of all your caregivers that are turning over. It's this small group of caregivers that you're having to replace like two or three or four times during the year because you've got typically this big group of established caregivers that are really great performers and you're just trying to add incrementally to that group and you have to do it over and over and over again. I looked back at 2009 and the number for annual turnover then was 39.4%. So
Wow.
in, I don't know, 15 years, we've about doubled the turnover rate. And I think that there's a few factors that are really playing into this and making this such a significant problem today. The first problem is we have exited this period of time where we had a reason for caregivers to come by the office. I shared a story a lot, and I was talking to an agency owner, and she said to me, we took a long time to go away from paper checks. And I took a second to like understand why she was telling me that. And what I realized when I said out loud was Oh, is that because you had people who had to come by the office to get their check, which gave her and her office 2 minutes to chat with that person and remind them, hey, we're people, we're here for you, we care about you, we're invested in your success. We want to make sure that, your needs are taken care of. And now that we have direct deposit, like caregivers don't come by to pick up their check anymore, which is a net positive. Like you got to pay people with direct deposit. It's just the way it is. But you did lose that little culture touch that was there. And then the second change is, we've all adopted scheduling systems that people are not having to drop off their timesheets anymore. And again, that's another reason people don't come by the office. I ask people what percent of their group, this is another kind of trend here, is post-COVID, we're done throwing parties, we're done getting together. And this is like a societal thing, but it is, I think, especially acute in home care. I ask people if you had and if you had to drop this in the chat, you can provide your response. If you did like a cookout, like a 4th of July or a Memorial Day or a Labor Day thing, what percent of your caregivers do you think you could get to show up? And I'll pause and see if anybody wants to use the chat to provide their answer. But what I typically get is like 15 or 20% of people might come by. And it's always the same 15 or 20%. And so there's a big group of our caregivers out there that are no longer responsive to those kinds of in-person gatherings. And so the question is, when we have less opportunities than ever to see our people, the typical methods of engaging those folks with like get-togethers and pizza parties and cookouts, when those no longer work, and then when you add on top of that all of the competition for frontline work, whether that's from fast food, whether that's from like Amazon warehousing centers, whether it's from Uber Eats and DoorDash and other kinds of gig work, there's a huge amount of pressure being put on our labor force. And what that says to me, because we can't compete with, a lot of these places on price, we can't compete with them necessarily on benefits. Like Taco Bell will, pay for your college tuition. And so the question is, what's our value prop to our caregivers? And I think the answer to that is, it's you get to do the work of caregiving. You get to do really meaningful work. You get to do work that you love, and you get to do it at a place that's a great place to work for. And so, anyways, the reason that Zengage exists is because there are a lot of caregivers who are caregivers. They're caregivers when they're at work, when they're not at work, and they want a great place to work. But as agencies scale and as they grow, it gets harder and harder to maintain that personal connection between the office and the caregivers. And it starts to feel like you're just kind of a number. The things that I hear from caregivers are stuff like, well, we only hear from the office if they need a favor or if we've made a mistake. And the things I'll hear from agencies that tell me that they've grown to the extent that things have gotten tricky for them is they'll say stuff like, well, our best caregivers hear from us the least. I was talking to one agency owner and he said, I lost my caregiver of the year 2 years ago and I still don't know why. And so those are the kinds of things that we were created to address, is to be able to scale the best practices in culture and make it so that your best caregivers hear from you a lot, and that your caregivers who aren't performing well are able to develop the right kinds of habits and practices and all those sorts of things to be able to become A+ caregivers. Connor, I can share a little bit more in specific detail about the solution, but I want to share a couple of things first that I've heard from agencies that they're doing that make a big impact on their culture. So I think there's two big things that I hear that can be real barriers to folks creating a culture of excellence and a culture where everybody feels like if they do good work that they will be recognized. So the first of those is there's this idea of I think it's a really pervasive kind of idea that caregivers won't learn new technology. And we know the story, right? Most caregivers are 55 plus. You're certainly going to get some younger people, maybe who are in nursing school, those sorts of things. But a large part of the caregiving population is folks who are a bit older and they're looking for something to do with their time. Maybe they're retired. This is kind of a second career where they get to make an impact. But the reality is our caregivers are not 30 or 40. They're typically 50 or 60 or maybe 70. And as a result, like these folks are not as quick to pick up new technology. But what we've seen is that they're using consumer technology. And folks on this call have probably had caregivers that they suspect might be playing like Candy Crush while they're, on the job. But these folks have learned how to use Facebook and Instagram and Messenger to keep up with their grandkids, and so I think there's a lot of pessimism towards adoption of new technology among caregivers. But I want to push back on that and say, like, we have seen caregivers adopt technology that's built with them in mind. So our team, part of my CTO's background, one of our co-founders, was at TikTok. And so how do we make consumer apps that are so easy to use that babies can learn how to use them, so that folks who are not digital natives, who aren't particularly tech savvy, can learn how to use them? And the result is that we've created a platform that's really, really easy for caregivers to use, and that is really impactful in creating this kind of digital culture. The second idea that I think is really important when it comes to building a culture of excellence is typically organizations will use rewards, recognition, engagement to solve really big problems that are emergencies. And the kind of use case for this is like last minute call. Everybody here has had a caregiver call out at the last minute and say, "Hey, I'm not going to be able to make it the shift. I'm sick. I have a flat tire. I'm just not coming," whatever the case may be. And you've got to scramble at the last minute to get somebody to pick up that shift. And I've talked to agency owners who will pay $25, $50, got even $100 to get that shift covered at the last minute. And it becomes kind of this, I'm going to hold out until the number gets good enough that it's worth my time to go to the shift. And what we've found is so much more impactful on the culture, on individual caregiver performance, is if you're able to very quickly, because how quick the reward takes place in relativity to the behavior is super important. But if you're able very quickly to recognize streak-based performance on key metrics over time, like attendance, like timeliness, like documentation submission, that goes a really long way towards solving for that attendance problem that results in the last minute call out. And so the things that we've seen make a huge impact on culture within a home care agency are using small incremental rewards tied to consistent performance over time to recognize and reward those kinds of top performers. And that really changes the kind of culture, what we recognize, what we celebrate, and then what in turn we get out of our caregivers. So, Connor, I know I shared a whole bunch of stuff. I've got plenty more that I could say, but I want to pause there and see what your thoughts are on all that.
Yeah, no, definitely a lot to unpack. And I think even, to that last point, right? We're looking at metrics that have maybe never even been looked at before, right? Whereas you mentioned kind of that in-person office environment, maybe for a lack of a better expression, baby got thrown out with the bathwater, right? In terms of getting that touch base, getting those little steps in place, and it sounds like one thing that's very similar with Shift Care and Engage is the idea that we're designing an app for people who are a little bit older, make it as low barrier to entry as possible to make sure that their lives are a little bit easier when adopting these tools. So on top of Zengage and what you guys are doing, looking at those like streak metrics, which is super cool. I think that's like a totally new way of looking at this, and one I haven't thought about much. What are ways that you've encouraged people to hold on to that culture that they maybe had back when they were in in-office environment? Because I imagine that's like a whole nother component, right? That's been kind of tossed to the side as we're transitioning out of COVID times.
Yeah, I think there's two kinds of agencies I typically come across. And one would say, we really like since COVID, we really kind of haven't developed our culture, our sense of identity. Like, what do you mean culture? This is home care. You can't really make culture in home care. And then I'll come across other people who are like, here are our core values. Here's the stuff that we like on a monthly basis recognize people on. But it just takes a lot of manual tracking and work to identify who the people are who are deserving of these things. And as a result, right, we're slow in doing it. And sometimes it slips through the cracks. And so we have this culture and these values that we've defined, but one of the barriers to be able to really implement that culture at scale is, well, we've got to do the manual tracking in like Excel and then put it in a weird pivot table and, kind of squint at it and make sure that the numbers kind of add up with our personal experience and stuff like that. And so I think like whichever boat you're in, if you're like, we kind of haven't really prioritized culture because we've been solving for so many other things, that's totally fine. I talk to people all the time who are in that boat. Or if you're in the place of like, yeah, we did like the work to identify our identity and values and culture as a company, but just scaling that out to 50, 70, 100 caregivers is really hard to do. We've seen people either bring in their culture to our platform and kind of set up their goals and messaging and stuff in alignment with that. Or we've had people say, hey, this is like kind of starting from a clean slate. Like, what do you recommend? And we've got some ideas that have been pretty helpful. And, from what we've seen, your best caregivers who typically hear from the office the least are your most consistent. And we want to design a incentive program and surveys and gamification and all the kinds of things that we do around who are your best caregivers and how do we make more of them. And that's folks who do referrals. That's folks who get recognized, get a call to the office from their client saying, hey, I just want to tell you how great Connor was today. Mom was having a hard day and he was super patient and we really appreciate it.
Yeah. No, that's super insightful. And one thing that leads me to think, especially your conversations with these agencies, they're kind of giving you thoughts on what they want to work on, or taking your advice. Oftentimes working with agencies, I've found, there is a group, and we might have some on this call where it's really just about keeping their head above water. And
Yeah.
there are a lot of things like addressing no-show rates, or addressing turnover rate. That would be like a great goal to get to once they get their head above water. Do you have any
Yeah.
advice for those agencies? Because I come across them a lot and would love, if they're on this chat, to get something out of this that they can take away for today.
Yeah. Um, I think like first of all, I think it can be kind of an isolating experience to feel like you're in a place where, the conventional kind of business wisdom is, hey, you need to work on your business and not in your business. But if you're starting up or you're going through kind of this transitional period of growth where like you're not quite ready to add an office person, and so you're kind of, have a foot in both worlds, that can be a really like overwhelming place to be in, and it can make it feel like you're kind of the only person who's ever been in a position where, everybody else is building a business and, creating systems and infrastructure and stuff, and you're over here just trying to like keep up. And so like if you're on this call and that's you, like first of all, that's where a whole bunch of people are, and it's a totally fine place to be. I think the question is, what are the things that need to be delegated? And those can be delegated to other people on your team. One of my favorite conversations I had recently was with this person named Amy Peterson Smith. She's on the podcast. You should go listen to this. And one of the things that she said is she goes, I 5 years ago, I wouldn't have imagined that I'd ever be in this position. But I don't know what my schedule looks like anymore. And she has grown her business and office team and trusted them through delegation to the extent where she didn't like a call it never stresses her out anymore because her team has systems in place to take care of it and does. So I think, sometimes what needs to happen is a push towards, hey, who are the people on your team that could be doing the stuff that you're doing today? What's the most impactful stuff that you could delegate and trust to somebody else and have the confidence that they're going to be able to execute on it? I think the other piece of that is, are there technologies out there that could functionally delegate some of this stuff that you're working on today and do it more consistently and reliably than you are? I'm a huge, huge believer in intelligent automation that's well designed, and that solves some very real problems. And there's lots of tools out there. We are certainly one of those tools. But thinking about, okay, what are the things that are taking up the most of my time, that are sucking my energy to where I can't really devote myself to the stuff that I know is going to move the business forward? And what are like the baby steps that I can take to reclaim some of my time and have those things taken care of by somebody who's not me.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, like taking that pause is a first step, understanding what your strengths are, where the strengths lie in your team. Um,
Yeah.
and that leads me into another question I had for you, David. When it comes to engagement, obviously,
Yeah.
people are thinking of what's the incentive for me to show up day in, day out, but thinking about their career, um, you know, where's my next step going to take me? Have you found that building in systems of promotion, of additional responsibilities, play a part in that reduction of turnover or higher engagement?
Yeah. So I think something that gets talked about but doesn't often get implemented really well is this idea of a career path for caregivers. And there's a small amount of caregivers that the career path is built in for, right? They're working with us while they're working on some kind of like licensure to be maybe like an LPN or an RN or something like that. But that's a very small portion of most of our employee groups. And so for the rest of us who are career caregivers, there's really not a defined career path, and it can feel like, okay, well, I'm just kind of treading water and I'm not really working towards anything. And so some of the smartest owners that I've learned from lately are people who have made their plan to build their office staff. Um, they've really hedged their bets on and gone all in on. I think I probably have my next scheduler in my caregiver population. Um, and we'll have kind of some stair steps up into that role. And I think this is really powerful for a couple of reasons. The first is if you can find somebody who's got all the other kinds of soft skills, work ethic, personality, culture fit to be a great scheduler and they're a caregiver, they are going to have so much like better rapport with your caregivers when it comes time to ask somebody to pick up a shift or, to like kind of flex their availability a little bit so that they can take on a particular case that would be a good fit for them. Um, but I think it also says something really valuable to your caregivers that even if I'm never going to become like the next scheduler or whatever, it makes me feel good that I work in an agency where we promote from within and nobody's just a caregiver, but people have potential to grow into new roles. I think there's also a lot of opportunity to create like cohort based or mentorship based kinds of relationships between senior caregivers and newer caregivers. We know 90-day retention is a really challenging metric to improve in this industry. We see a bunch of turnover happen in the first 90 days. It's super frustrating. You don't get those people to productivity. It's really stressful for a lot of people's businesses. And one of the things that we've seen make a really positive impact on that is doing like mentorship shifts or having a caregiver that's kind of like a lead caregiver that I can call anytime I have a question about like how to use the technology or, I just had this happen with a client that's never happened before. Like, what should I do next? And that can offload some manual work from the office team, can give certain caregivers, some enhanced responsibilities. You probably need to pay them a little bit more in light of that, but then can make new hires feel like, oh, well, it's not just like us versus the office. I've got people in the field advocating for me as well.
Yeah. No, and I mean, I think that makes a ton of sense, right? If you're stepping into a new agency, and like we mentioned at the beginning, every one of these agencies is their own silo of processes that have been built over time as things have grown. You can't expect a caregiver to step into the field on a first shift and know what those processes are going to look like. So yeah, I totally agree. And then what you were saying, especially about like a scheduler who was previously a caregiver, having a lot more insight into how things typically go at the agency. From my experience, when I'm demoing shift care to a scheduler, it's really easy to tell if they've been a caregiver at that age before because
Mm,
their first question is, well, how does that look for the caregiver? How is this
yeah,
actually going to reflect on their daily experience, which is such a valuable insight to have when looking at a schedule, looking at drive times between client one and client two. And those are the same schedulers that I've found who advocate for the agency much more than, a scheduler who's hired externally. So, um, yeah, no, that's great. Um, and additionally, kind of going back to the technology side of things, um, do you have any recommendations on when it comes to taking a look at your agency, right? Let's say processes are manual, and it sounds like Zengage is typically a part of a technology stack. Um, any kind of first steps you can give to an agency who's maybe all manual processes right now when it comes to, approaching technology for the first time?
Yeah, it's a good question. And when you say all manual, how manual are we talking here? Like, do they have a scheduling system in place? Do they have like a payroll processor in place?
So I'd say the majority of the agencies I speak with, and the ones who'd be coming in through Shift Care's channels, usually don't have a scheduling system, maybe
Yep.
direct deposit, and
Yep.
typically, learning's done in person.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the things like if I was gonna kind of build my tech stack from the ground up, assuming that there's nothing there, I think the first thing I would do is I'd find a really good scheduling system, and one that's easy to use, and especially easy. One of the big predictors of turnover is if a caregiver is having to commute too far to get to their case. And so I think the kind of logistics challenge of like GPS and routing and those kinds of things are something to keep in mind. But yeah, find a good scheduling system. One of the big questions that I would ask about is like it's this idea of interoperability, which is how easy is it to get my data from my scheduling system into another system? And are there automated ways to do that? That may not matter when you're at, 10 clients, but it will matter a whole lot when you're at 40 or 60 or 100 clients. And then the second thing that I would do is get a payroll provider that is easy to use and that you can use to pay weekly if that becomes important. Typically, either the scheduling system or the payroll provider will have some kind of like daily pay or some additional kinds of earned wage access. That can be super powerful too as a differentiator. So I feel like scheduling system, good payroll provider. Um, Something else that is really important is a good applicant tracking system that you're gonna use and keep really clean and keep your applicants moving through the employment pipeline. So I think those three things are like I would have to have basically from day one. And then I think, as you begin to grow your group of caregivers, um, you know, at a certain point, it becomes really unwieldy to just be able to text each caregiver in a one-on-one kind of way. And that's where a system like Zengage can be really impactful is, okay, cool, we've built something good up to this point, but now we're starting to kind of see some stuff slip through the cracks as it relates to scheduling and our relationships with caregivers and those kinds of things. And that's when it's a good time for to reach out to us and figure out how some of the automated stuff that we can do around goals and streaks and recognition and birthdays and anniversaries and surveys, all this kind of stuff can really start to be really impactful.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think this might be a good time to switch into a brief demo.
Sure.
So what we can do is we'll start with Shift Care. I'll pull up my scheduler here. And for those of you not using a system, definitely would encourage taking a look at the different scheduling systems out there. To just give you a quick overview of Shift Care and kind of tie it into a little bit about what we're talking about. So taking a look at my dashboard here, you'll see the scheduler, which is really kind of just the focus, the main lifeblood of the plan here. On the flip side, we do have a caregiver app where they're going to see everything reflected in the scheduler. They'll have geolocated clock in, clock out with notifications, mandatory care notes, and ADLs. that all ties back into the client profile. So if you update something here, it's going to go straight to your caregivers, not really have to worry about binders or collecting timesheets. That's a nice addition here. But kind of going exactly along the lines of what we've been talking about in terms of engagement. Um, One thing that's great about Shift Care, and I'll walk you through a scenario similar to what Dave was saying. So right now, I am listed as a caregiver here, working with Freddie Mercury from 2 to 5. Let's say I call out last minute, hey, had a tire blow, not going to be able to make it to a shift. Really nice thing with Shift Care here is if we click on the shift, which of course can be set up as repeating, we can go ahead and create and adjust the mandatory and optional ADLs, build out things like mandatory care notes and client signatures. But let's say I have a last minute call out and I can't make a shift. What I can do is jump in here, and this shift is with me. If I'm unavailable, I can actually send this directly out to another caregiver in this client's team, so that that client is going to be seen by someone who's already worked with Freddie before. Huge for making sure you're engaging the caregivers that are actually going to be able to pick this shift up. And then additionally, we can add this to the job board. So it's going to go out as a notification only to staff who have listed availability and are not actively working a shift. So just important to meet caregivers where they're at. And then we can also make this open to, dementia care certified caregivers, Freddie Mercury's team, Bob's team. So taking it to the next level, right? Making sure you're not putting a caregiver in a situation that they can't handle. This will only go out to people who are qualified to work with them. Additionally, we can go ahead and filter by languages, compliance, competencies. Do they have trainings? How far are they from the client's home address? All little things that are going to help. And because we are designed very specifically for this industry, this is all designed with caregiver experience and client feedback in mind. So this is just one of quite a few ways that this can work to help most agencies. Feel free after this. We're going to send out links for book a demos or sharing more info. But at this point, I'd love David to see a little bit about Zengage and how that would actually work for your clients.
Yeah, I can share briefly here. So I'll show kind of the caregiver facing view of this. And actually I'll start with something, Connor, that you set up, which is being able to send out those kind of notifications and tie some gamification to it. I love to see that you guys already have the concept of employee groups in your backend. That's something that's really smart to have built, is like, here's the folks who are weekend warriors or who are dementia certified or whatever the case may be. And so we found that this announcement tool is a great way to incentivize some folks with 500 points, 200 points, whatever. That's like $2 or $5, and then use those response features to kind of create that short list of folks who are interested. But really kind of the core of our platform is in this goal center. A lot of our caregivers come here to see just really role clarity. What are the kinds of things that I need to do to be successful and to get recognized and to continue to kind of progress in my career? And so these are all very simple to customize. We've got some recommendations that people can use out of the box, but we find a lot of folks like to kind of tweak their program to get, better results and make sure that their reward spend is really efficient. And so that's stuff like clock in using the mobile app, clock out, on time, have perfect attendance, do your documentation, complete compliance trainings, those sorts of things. And we automatically track the progress of these events in a scheduling system and then divvy out points when those are met. And then caregivers can go into the gift card store and then get gift cards from a bunch of different places like Amazon and Starbucks, and Visa gift cards for gas and groceries and Target and Walmart. And they can redeem those in $5 increments. Those gift cards just show up immediately in their wallet. One of the things that's been really exciting is when somebody redeems a gift card, we ask them a quick question like, what's one skill you've mastered that makes you a better caregiver? And I'll share a specific one that I saw, which was um, I learned how to use a Hoyer lift. Uh, and so I saw that come through, and we used some AI to evaluate if these comments are appropriate before we put them in the social feed. But I saw that one actually come through, and of course, it was totally appropriate. The AI was like, "Yep, we'll put that out there." And then it's what I love about that is the next time you need to do like a training on how to, take care of a client who needs to use a Hoyer lift. Why not get that caregiver who was super excited about that progression in her career, um, come and do that? So, anyways, we get the social feed where we shout out all the great stuff that happens within the organization, birthdays and work anniversaries, and when people complete quests and goals. And then the last thing I'll mention, referrals. I think everybody knows your best caregivers can bring in your best caregivers, but typically referral programs are underutilized. And part of the reason for that is we wait a long time to reward people, and it's a pretty manual process to provide those rewards. And so we make it really easy for folks to add referrals to the pipeline. And then we use this kind of like Domino's pizza tracker to pay attention to where a referral is in process and have these milestones that we can create where we're automatically divvying out those rewards as this person reaches certain productivity milestones. So, all really great ways to reward the right kind of behavior. There's a guy in the space, his name's Stephen Tweed. And one of the things that he said that I always remember is what gets measured gets managed, and what gets rewarded gets repeated. And that's a big part of the philosophy that we've brought to Buildings Engage is how do we make it really clear what the kinds of activities are that get you shouted out and rewarded and recognized in front of your peers, and how do we make it so that people create, develop the kinds of habits that result in them always doing the kinds of things that get them rewarded and recognized.
Yeah, I love that. I think three things I took away from that is, you know, one big thing that I've noticed, especially when it comes to like a late clock in or a missed shift, is you always see a paycheck going down, right? It's always a negative reflection on the status quo if things maybe don't go as planned. Whereas this gives an opportunity for people to see a net positive, right, from doing the right things. Um,
Yeah.
and then that referral bonus, that's so cool. I usually see just a 90-day payout, and it almost seems
Yep.
like it's an all or nothing. The agency's kind of hacking it. But that's so cool to help, keep progress going, right, with those referrals. And then the gamification of that peer review. I One thing I love about working in an industry that is so collaborative is people like to share like what's successful, right? And that translates to caregivers as well. So I think that's super cool platform. And I know we only have you, David, for a little bit longer. Would love to open up the chat to a Q&A and see if there's any questions for either David or I just on what's been discussed, or we can go ahead and open the floor to um, whatever our viewers have questions about. I have to say, David, I can definitely see the TikTok shining through in that feed. It looks very engaging.
Yeah. Well, thanks. That's high praise. I always tell people instead of trying to get folks addicted to Russian propaganda, we're just trying to get them addicted to doing excellent work at their jobs. And we've done a pretty good job.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me see here. While we're waiting, I think I've got a couple questions from my team that they were excited you're coming on and wanted to get some questions answered on those. I guess while we're waiting for that, David, home care hindsights. I'm curious, that
Yeah.
name, was that the chicken or the egg that you focus on hindsights, or you realize hindsight was kind of the backbone to having 2020 vision about what's working and not?
Yeah. I think the kind of inspiration for the idea was actually a little bit simpler and more selfish, which was um, I think it's easy. Yeah, I think it would be like low-hanging fruit to be like, I want to start a podcast and ask people the thing that they're best at. But I was like, I think that would get boring to me after a little while. My brain's kind of weird. And so my initial thought was, what's the kind of thing that I could talk about like every week for like the rest of my life? And I felt like asking people in this industry who were pretty accomplished what they'd screwed up at seemed like it would be fun. And as the thing has kind of progressed and grown, I realized like, yeah, the whole hindsight's 2020, which I guess I'm hindsight 2020, my hindsight 2020. It's a little bit of
Yeah.
a idea turducken there. But the I realized like that idea is built for home care because everybody in this industry is like, oh, you want to hear about mistakes? I've made a million of them. And I just, I was happy to see that my idea of like what can I do that's interesting that keeps me engaged, um, and it aligns so well with like what people had kind of already been dying to talk about and just didn't have the forum for it.
Yeah. Well, I love the reflection and the original reasoning for it. Um,
Yeah.
and then jumping into some of these questions, any thoughts? I'll leave this to you, David. Any thoughts on the philosophy hire fast, fire faster in the home care space?
Um, I think it's tough, right? I think you've got to have some kind of non-negotiables, right? If there's ultimately we have a responsibility to keep our clients safe. And so if a caregiver is doing something that puts your client's safety, physical safety, emotional well-being, like financial safety, there's always risk of fraud, anything like that, immediate, zero strikes and we're out. But I also think, um, the often folks who are in caregiver roles are coming from a much more complex kind of sociocultural economic background than I've come from. And it's folks who childcare is a major concern. Or a sick kid can really ruin their whole schedule and kind of mess up some stuff. And so I think, you've got to take these things with a lot of grace. I think a lot of people deserve a second chance, but I do think when it comes to some of the non-negotiables that put somebody at risk, like it's an easy decision to move on from somebody who, you know, provides a lot of risk to your business and to your brand and to your clients.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. This is a client focused business, right? And if there's some challenges with staff, step one would be addressing that, and then step two, I imagine would be looking at a hiring process. What did we maybe miss? What
Sure.
processes can we improve next time? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and then another one we have, David. Best tip on encouraging a caregiver to improve certain skills and how to reward that process.
Yeah, I think other than the obvious one, which is like buy our software, I think, really focusing on habits over outcomes is a really important kind of thing to think through because so often we're addressing kind of the last the last behavior in the chain of behaviors that led up to the point, right? The attendance issue beget the call out, and so we're incentivizing the person who's the hero and picks up the last minute shift. And I think anything you can do to get closer to that consistent performance that makes the business predictable is really valuable. And it can be as simple as run a report at the end of the month and figure out everybody who had perfect attendance and didn't have any call outs and send them a text, send them a gift card, or do a small bonus on their check. Make sure you're accounting for those things from a tax perspective. But I think it doesn't have to feel like eating an elephant to get into finding your one KPI that needs the biggest help. and figure out how to really spotlight that and celebrate that activity.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, just taking that extra time, like we talked about, keeping your head above water is step one. Step two is how have we been doing? How can we improve from here? Um, and then last question we'll go through before jump in. Who should own the rollout of these platforms?
Yeah. It's interesting. It kind of depends, right? Ultimately, like the business owner is accountable for this thing being a success, right? But often I'm talking with agencies, and um, there's somebody in the organization that is the biggest advocate for caregivers. And other people might think they're kind of a softie when it comes to caregivers, and they might kind of be a pushover. And I often think that an agency will know who their most caregiver centric biggest advocate is. Um, and that can often be the person who kind of is close to the day-to-day implementation. Like obviously, like you still got to give them a budget. They're going to stick within that budget when it comes to the rewards piece, and you want to make sure that none of the things are you get a second set of eyes on those. But honestly, my preference is whoever's most passionate about building a culture of really engaged caregivers. That's who I want to own the implementation and rollout of what we're doing.
Awesome. Yeah, and I definitely agree when it comes to the shift care side. Yeah, who has the caregiver's best interest in mind? And additionally, for shift care, I always ask who's feeling the most pain. Um, Caregiver should be in the top three there because if there's any struggles with an agency, the caregivers are feeling those. Maybe not first, maybe not second, but they're feeling it. So yeah, absolutely. We need more advocates for caregivers in these conversations. And I think with that, we're just about over time. Any final thoughts from you, David, before we jump?
No, just really appreciate you having me on, and super excited to see what you guys are building at Shift Care. I mean, it's a super intuitive system that's really easy to use, and that makes the caregiver experience something that is less friction and a whole lot more opportunity. So love to see what you guys are doing.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thanks so much for jumping on and sharing more about Zengage. If anyone wants to learn a little bit more, we're going to be following up with an email with mine and David's contact info, as well as how to get a hold of us to get a demo of these platforms or see future webinars. Take care.
Sounds good. See you guys.